Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Knapp, and I'm the Chief Economist at IAB Europe, and I very much look forward to this session on exploring the opportunities for connected TV advertising in Europe.
And I'm Emma Newman, and I'm the CRO for EMEA for PubMatic. Also looking forward to having this conversation with Daniel. But before we do that, let me hand back to him so he can just spend a few minutes setting the scene.
Thanks, Emma. I think we all know that CTV is a tremendous opportunity. It's more than a buzzword. It's front and center of many company reports of key projections for growth. But I wanted to just quantify a little bit of what is it actually that we're talking about so that we can have a more substantive discussion. And when we speak about television, I think it's important to bear in mind we're not talking about any old other medium. Actually, if we look back in time, television is the medium of the 20th century, the medium that gave rise to modern consumer culture. Here we see data reaching back to the end of the First World War, and we can really see the explosion of television in the 1960s. So the society that we live in today, the consumer society, wouldn't be possible without this medium. And television is, of course, being disrupted right now with a move towards over the top and a digital logic being infused in this world. So how we do that, it's not only a big opportunity, but also we need to be conscious and careful of how we execute it, just because of the history and the importance of this medium. The nature of TV is fundamentally changing. You can see here that there's an explosion of streaming services, both paid for and ad funded, that are competing for consumer attention. And nearly every day or every week, we're seeing new initiatives. So last week, we saw an announcement of Google TV launching and Planet V, for instance, a new ITV addressable solution launching in the UK. All this is taking place at a radically changing device landscape. Smart TVs, in terms of shipments, are increasingly becoming the default for consumers across the world and also across Europe, where in 2029, we already had nearly 80% of all shipments being smart, which of course with a short delay also affects the overall installed base, which means a completely different infrastructure of devices in the living room, which enables this new opportunity. We're already also seeing an inflection point in how people access television and television-like content. And this is nowhere more apparent than in the SVOD landscape. We look at the global OTT subscriptions, they have now overtaken pay TV. This is a structural trend that is going forward year after year. 2020, of course, was an important year in this because of the lockdown and also because of sports events not being available on live TV, on pay TV, the launch of Disney Plus and other services. But of course, as we see SVOD stacking, more and more services being added, we're seeing a consumer fatigue, we're seeing what is being squeezed. So there's a second effect that this trend also fuels hybrid and in the next wave also AVOD-based solutions. And this, while this used to be contained to the US, we're talking about Europe today, this is no longer just a United States phenomenon, but it's happening across the world. So this cord cutting really provides a really fertile ground for the rise of CTV. The real impact of COVID has not just been a decline in ad revenues overall, but a shift in how they're being allocated. If we look at this chart here, we can see a structural transformation where more and more is systematically spent on digital. And this, of course, also means that other media need to reinvent themselves and build a bridge to digital media, and television is front and center of that. There's lots of data on CTV, on growth. Most hard figures come from the US, but we have lots of indications that this is a strong opportunity in Europe as well. If we look at some market statistics, this consumption changes can translate into tremendous growth. If we look at how the AVOD market is stacked up, we can see that by 2024, already a third is likely going to be CTV ads. And we figure out some of the long-tail advertising in China, which has a very specific market structure. It's going to be even more. And there are structural factors here which are boosting this, as you can see on the right side. Definitions are important, and we're going to talk about this in a second. There's an abundance of different definitions and a definition confusion. We need to fix that in order to put this growth on a good track. Also, we're seeing an opening up of the competitive landscape where incumbents are faced with new entrants and new innovations. So very interesting to see how this battle for the consumer, battle for attention will play out. I conclude by saying that this opportunity is quite different to the digital ad opportunity, which on the right you see a strong concentration on just very few markets. But if you look at television on the left, you can see there's a tremendous addressable market in Europe where you have a lot of markets that are $1 billion plus. So we're likely going to see a less concentration in the proliferation of CTV just by looking at the incumbent TV market than we've seen in the digital space. And with this, I very much look forward to my discussion with Emma. Thank you. Do you see Europe as this aggregate region, or what do you think? What countries are most advanced? And can you give us a little bit of reading of also some specific companies that are pushing the opportunity?
So I think that first and foremost, Europe is not a country, something that I spend quite a lot of time reinforcing. But that said, you know, we have undertaken some research across the region, and there are definitely differences between each of the individual markets. But there were two things that came back from that research that were consistent with regards to the CTV space. First is there's a lack of unified definition. There's definitely a lack of consistency in terminology, both within and across markets. So for example, HBB TV and IPTV are regarded as CTV by some, but not by others. Some regard it as smart TV inventory only, or on-demand apps only, or even bundled it with all of their digital inventory. So there's definitely a lack of unified definition, and that's potentially holding things back. There's also a lack of confusion, or actually it's not a lack of confusion, there is a confusion around the role of CTV. And there's varying responsibilities on the buy side around who owns CTV. So battle for CTV control across teams, certainly within the buyers, seems to be quite prevalent. You know, there's an overall trend, which is DSPs see it as digital and agencies vary. Broadcasters see it as digital, but as a digital extension of TV, not digital native. I think there are alliances are starting to form to fend off the Google competition and increase addressable market. Cooperation is definitely starting to take place on technology standards, and also sales houses are working together. So there is a degree of coming together, and I think that coming together can be regarded as historic. We've not really seen that in the past. So despite a lack of market maturity, there's already deeper collaboration on CTV than in most digital platforms. When you start to think about, you know, some of the market differences, so those two things were consistent. When you start to think about market differences, what some of the things the research has shown us that, you know, by far the UK is Europe's most advanced market. You know, it has, it's the most mature market. It's probably most aligned to the US. There is definitely scale from buyers. There's high tech penetration. And I think it's a bellwether for how competition will play out between broadcasters and the new TV platforms like Amazon and Roku, Google, pay TV providers, et cetera, et cetera. If you start to think about Germany, you know, the HBB TV standard's been a huge market driver in Germany, placing CTV firmly into the TV heritage rather than the digital heritage camp. So that goes back to my previous comment about where does this actually sit. This has allowed for more controlled expansion and testing on the sell side without disintermediation fears. Although HBB TV is complemented with other models of viewing and selling ads. And it's a strong existing market with a very consolidated sales house structure. So it could make that a model market for how the sell side can win if they collaborate together. The French market's got a strong IPTV heritage and is a programmatic innovator market in display. But also the regulatory environment has artificially held back CTV, although we have seen some changes in that recently. So I think France is an extremely exciting place at the moment as the regulations on addressable advertising have been lifted. So you could say the market is on the cusp of an addressable revolution. You go down to Spain, very active market community in driving standardization. the buying landscape is very much dominated by the agencies. The pandemic has driven down CPMs massively on linear TV. So that's so cheap now that the attractive scale matters more than the innovative channels for many buyers. And actually, when you talk to the buyer side experts, they expect YouTube and the US players to dominate the market if the local players don't collaborate. So there's that whole thing about collaboration again. In Italy, broadcasters are extremely concerned about competition from YouTube, and sell-side consolidation are likely to come together to pool resources, in particular around data. Agencies are definitely investing in DMPs to combine first-party data. Most CTV is currently sold direct. Programmatic pipes have been developed, but more sort of as a future-proof solution rather than something that's actually happening today. In Sweden, the market is extremely nascent, very little activity overall. The vast majority of inventory is sold direct and is usually bundled with linear TV. The programmatic infrastructure does exist, and there is contradictory that there is oversupply despite small markets, because programmatic buyers can't activate CTV inventory due to their PII and cookie-based targeting parameters. So as you can see, yes, there are some consistencies, but there is a lot of difference across each of the individual markets. And that's why when anybody is approaching EMEA, you need to think of it as, individual markets, not as a region or as a country. There are, varying differences. And I think that if you're going to be successful in CTV in EMEA, you need to understand those and factor those into anything that you do.
I think that's been very clear from your answer that not only are the markets different, but they're also at different stages of development. And macro themes seem to be similar, like global competition. How do you define it? Who's responsible on the buy and sell side? What kind of logic, digital or TV buying logic, is CTV embedded in? And then lastly, the theme of collaboration, which I found particularly fascinating, because if we look at the history of publisher alliances, for instance, in the display space or even in the AVOD space, very early on, the market realized that we need to aggregate things together, to work together, to provide sufficient scale and few singular points of access, where more concentration paradoxically meant enabling more media diversity. But many of these initiatives, if we go back, these go back 8 years, many of these have now vanished from the face of the earth. And there were a few kind of inherent problems in those. The first was governance structure. Who's responsible for this, and what commitments do individual companies really place on it? And the second was, what's being shared? Is it just inventory? Is it also data, people, and so forth? And I think we have learned as an industry from how to not run such cooperatives or alliances. And at the same time, as you said, I think in CTV it's even more important because the prize is so much bigger. There's so much to lose if you get it wrong, but there's so much to gain if you get it right. So building these alliances in a different way than what happened in the display space, 2010, 2012 onwards, is key for the success of CTV, I believe.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think there's two other things as well, which is, I think one of the reasons why some of perhaps those traditional display alliances didn't succeed was the points that you made: governance, what are you sharing? Is it data? Is it audience? Is it inventory? Pricing models. But also, you've got a bunch of people who have been so used to competing against each other that just even that mind shift is quite challenging. And so definitely, I think that the CTV space, look back at what's happened in the past, learn from the past. Take what worked, ignore what didn't. That definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, let's not do that. But if you think about, we've talked about CTV and how it's expanding and how it's slightly different. What is the role of programmatic in your view in CTV in Europe? How will it develop? How will it help the industry develop?
I think it's important to not do the second step before the first. definitely all media are becoming programmatic at some point or the other. We're seeing it, we saw that evolution from display to video. We're seeing it in out of home. Well, we even have print media, so paper, being transacted programmatically. And in all of these examples, you see that what programmatic actually is extremely different. In one spectrum, you got open market RTB, so which is a real-time buying and selling, and for others, it's more programmatic planning, using data to predict and to optimize the media buy. We've already touched in our conversation on the concerns of the sell side in protecting their inventory. And I think here the experience from programmatic really comes into the play, where most sellers have direct sales strategies. They are bundling CTV with linear TV in inventory, where a programmatic approach at scale often isn't possible right now. I see programmatic really as the second phase of the evolution, when there is more liquidity in terms of the supply. But I believe we are going to, although it's very small right now, we're going to see a bit of a forced acceleration. And let me come back to one of the points you made earlier about faster planning cycles. What this unique circumstances in 2020 have shown is that marketers are starting to plan differently. So we had tactical and strategic approaches at both ends of the spectrum. But increasingly, we're seeing something which I would call opportunistic marketing, which is finding windows of opportunities in a very uncertain environment, where, let's say, a travel ban is being lifted, where certain things are becoming possible for consumers again, where you need short planning and really, really fast execution cycles. And it's this switch on, switch off nature of programmatic that can be incredibly helpful here. Also, if all media are being transacted programmatically, and we are moving away from third-party cookies in a world of micro walled gardens and silos, there's the question of orchestration. How do I really connect the world of display, of performance media, of out of home, of e-commerce, and so on? How do I connect that in a holistic strategy to what's happening on television? So I see programmatic here as the connective infrastructure, potentially between all of those different silos. So if CTV wants to be part of a broader media mix, which is increasingly digital, having this programmatic infrastructure is going to be important. Now, is it going to be OMP? Is it going to be PMP? Will we not have auction models at all? That's a big question. I see, because of the limited inventory, in particular in the premium environment, there's going to be a stronger focus on direct deals or PMPs in the beginning. But having spoken to a lot of broadcasters recently, they are already planning for a programmatic future, which isn't there yet. So I was surprised to hear that many already have programmatic partnerships and visions in place how a programmatic world of CTV would look like, which seems to be that there's a 2 or 3 year planning going on in the background behind the actual opportunity right now. So, well, the market is small. Everyone is expecting it to be there. And many market participants are kind of wise enough to already think about it now. Should we do a waterfall structure? I'll say no. Do we need to talk about header bidding? And you mentioned you have a solution. And at least in theory, I see market participants taking these interactions seriously, and people who even come from a legacy TV background, using the programmatic language, if you will, are being familiar with concepts that a couple of years ago, the TV world would say, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Yeah. But let's stick with programmatic right now. I mean, you have followed the evolution of programmatic for quite a while, both its opportunities and pitfalls. What would be your message to buyers and sellers? How can they learn from what happened in programmatic so far, and how can they really ensure that they are readying themselves for a programmatic CTV future?
So I think that, I mean, you've touched on that, CTV isn't exactly programmatic yet, although I would suggest that, recent announcements from ITV Channel 4 and the Trade Desk certainly seem to be as though there is a push in that direction. So maybe it's sooner rather than later, who knows. I do think that, you know, there's some things that the CTV programmatic landscape ecosystem, call it what you will, can learn from the programmatic ecosystem that was display. I think that, you know, some things to think about is that, you know, display went a little bit down a rabbit hole. You know, the market quickly developed into a shouting contest about who had the best one-to-one targeting machine. Mm-hmm. You know, then it sort of ran into this headline, you know, sort of ran headlong towards the direct response side of things, potentially at the expense of the consumer experience, which may have affected long-term publisher revenues and arguably offered little or no benefit to brand marketing. And while some publishers and tech players may have excellent data sets to enable micro-targeting on CTV, I think, you know, back to the point we said earlier on, you know, TV is TV is TV. CTV needs to respect, you know, the empirical proven value of linear TV when it comes to being able to build brands and have cost-effective reach in a high-quality environment. So I think that that's really important. You know, even in the programmatic landscape, recognize CTV for what it is, you know, and learn from display, and make sure that, to your point, CTV is probably closer to linear TV than it is potentially to digital advertising. So think about that as you sort of move into this programmatic space, because it can be programmatic. You just need to be, you know, aware of the role that you're going to play, both for your consumer, but also for your advertiser. But Daniel, if you think about that, you know, I mean, there's a huge opportunity there. I think everybody can agree with that. And, you know, the pace and, you know, some things are accelerating, some things are decelerating. What steps do you think the industry should take collectively, you know, to support the growth and development of the connected TV ecosystem?
I think the way how you phrased the question is really interesting. You said, what steps could the industry take? And I think you're already hitting kind of the nail on the head, is that it's not a question whether steps to collectively need to be taken or not. It is, which are those steps? So the industry, it's not optional for the industry together to take some steps. They must take some steps together, because what we have described in our discussion here, this opportunity isn't going to make itself. I mean, we in Europe, we have to make the market. And but just looking at the US and saying this wave of opportunity will spill over naturally is not going to happen. So going back to the real basics, is we need a joint definition that is industry consensus. What is CTV? And that definition needs to be detached from the business models of those who are in the landscape, because everybody, depending on what they buy, what they sell, will have their own definition. And I really wish for people to come together as industry experts, not as representatives of a given company, but as industry experts who want to bring this ecosystem forward, to sit down together, maybe with us at the IAB or in other contexts, to define what is CTV or not. Because this certainty is extremely important for buyers to know what are they buying, and for sellers, what am I investing in? What is the opportunity? What standards should I have, and so forth. HBB TV was one of those standards, but we see there's a lot more happening. The second thing is about scale, how to preserve the attractiveness of the scale of television. And we've already seen when DTT came about back in 2000, back in 2012. I was doing a lot of work on that space, in particular in Spain. We realized that the market is actually too small. The market is too small for so many new free-to-air broadcasters, and we have seen a wave of consolidation afterwards, where if we think of Cuatro and La Sexta, two Spanish DTT stations, were being acquired and absorbed into existing groups. And something similar needs to happen in the CTV space as well. Consolidation of inventory, fewer points of access, which then allow better standardization and easier buying. So these collaborations that we talked about, I think they need to be accelerated on a national level. And probably if we look at what's being done on the data side, maybe also on an international level. Because competition, it doesn't mean just we need to talk about providing joint inventory, but how can we analyze it as a seller? How can we make data available? That often requires costly investments. And if those investments are being shared about infrastructure and so forth, you can de-risk your investments and work much faster. So I think these are some of the key things from just my industry observation point of view, what the industry needs to do. But you in this industry yourself, Emma, so what do you think are the key things that need to happen to make this market a reality?
Everything that you said, I agree with, obviously. And I think it's, there's this consistent theme that's running through the conversation that you and I are having, but also the research that we've done and what you generally hear about in the marketplace. And I think we can kind of sum it up quite succinctly, which is education and collaboration are absolutely key. So that's the first thing. Take the time to learn from what I call the original digital publishers. Don't make the same mistakes they did. So if we, as an industry, if we listen, we share, and we learn, then I genuinely believe that we can leapfrog some of the hurdles that have been faced in the past.
I think the term leapfrog is really important, because we don't want to have this five-year phase where we're figuring out how can we correct our mistakes. And I think the CTV world is very well set up to avoid that and build something that is sustainable. At least I could say, I could talk about this topic forever, and it's fascinating. And I want to thank you for your time. I think looking at the virtual organizers, our time here is up. But thank you everyone for listening. Thank you, Emma, for having this conversation with me. It was hugely enjoyable.
Thank you.